Hello there, this is Pilgrim. Today we will be looking at the World War I battlefield of Hartmannswillerkopf. As you can see, we are still pretty close to Thann. Here's the old town, and the battlefield we will be visiting is, in direct line, just somewhat over 7 kilometers away, or slightly more than 4 miles. But before we dive in, let's take a look at it from the bird's eye perspective first. Since this is a forested mountain area, there's not too much we can see, but a couple of things still stand out. For example, this building down to the left, which is a museum. Next would be the crypt and the memorial. The largest part, however, is the military cemetery. Everything west of that, right from your perspective, is the former battlefield. It extends even further still. However, that treeless area to the right is as far as we will go. But before we start, a couple of words about the First World War itself and a short visit to the museum. Despite being the largest war of its time, the First World War is a conflict that is often overlooked. However, if you care to look closely, its traces can be found basically everywhere. Being interested in church architecture, this was impossible for me to overlook to begin with. For memorials regarding this conflict are often not restricted to cemeteries, but also extend to churches to a large degree, as can be seen here. This is from the last village I passed before entering the mountain range. Lasting from mid-1914 until the end of 1918, the First World War had a duration of about 4 years. The loss of life and devastation it caused was tremendous and previously unheard of. It was so terrible of a conflict that people imagined it could never get any worse than this. And in a sense, they were right. Although usually overshadowed by its big brother, the Second World War, throughout most of the world, due to its longer duration and even greater number of casualties, things are different in France. For never before had the French army suffered casualties like it did in the First World War, nor would those numbers ever be surpassed. The same can be said about the British army. Yes, it is true, more French and British soldiers died during the First World War than would during the Second, which is why this conflict has a more prominent place in the collective memory of those nations as compared to Germany or most other countries. Take a closer look at this memorial, for example. At first glance you would guess that the casualties of World War I would be less than the ones of World War II. And technically speaking, you would be correct. However, if you look closer, you can tell that the casualties of World War II are comprised of military personnel and civilians, whereas the ones of the First World War are military personnel only. And thus, if you happen to compare military losses, the First World War is actually in the lead, confirming what I just told you. Now, that's not to say that one category is more important than the other, or less important than the other for that matter. I'm simply pointing out that the First World War is a conflict that is hugely underestimated, at least throughout most of the world, as compared to France and Britain, where the First World War is often called the Great War, for good reason. Which, of course, the Battle of Hartmannswillerkopf was a part of. While the First World War lasted from 1914 until 1918, the most ferocious battles at the Hartmannswillerkopf took place in 1915 and early 1916, therefore at the beginning of the war, the location being somewhat of an anomaly of World War I. Let me explain. It is generally believed that most fighting at the Western Front took place outside German territory, and for the most part that's true. Here you can see a map of Europe, and this is what the front line looked like in 1915. It's just a rough approximation, but you get the idea. As you can see, it's all in France and Belgium. However, this is a map of Europe today, meaning early 2026. Back in 1914, when the war first broke out, things were entirely different. As far as Germany, or what was back then known as the German Empire, is concerned, things looked like this. Again, this is just a rough approximation, but it is more or less accurate. The important part being that the southern end of the front line was running through German territory. I'm talking about this bit specifically, also known as Reichsland Elsass-Lothringen. It is true, this land had only become German a bit more than 40 years ago, after the German victory in the Franco-Prussian War, but it was still an internationally recognized territorial shift beyond reasonable dispute, therefore completely legal at this point in time. However, when the war broke out in 1914, France was determined to reclaim its lost territory as soon as possible. In order to do that, an offensive in the south was launched, the Battle of Hartmannswillerkopf being a result of this operation. However, for the most part, this offensive failed. While some territory was taken back, like Thann for example, which stayed in French hands until the end of the war, The offensive was halted and pushed back by a German counteroffensive. Mulhouse, for example, which had been liberated by the French, was soon enough liberated yet again by German forces and stayed German, like most of Alsace, for the entirety of the war. While both sides tried to break through the enemy line in what turned out to be attacks that were more or less senseless, the result was always the same: a mounting death toll with no end in sight and no change of the overall situation. Therefore the conflict froze, like everywhere else on the Western Front, turning into static trench warfare. As it turned out, France, just like every other nation involved, was woefully unprepared for the requirements of a modern war, which was to be dominated by the machine gun. The early war French uniforms paying tribute to that fact. Which is why they switched to the uniform you can see to the right later on. The Germans had similar problems. While they didn't wear any red, their helmet, the so-called Pickelhaube, was entirely unsuited for trench warfare. In essence, it was just a leather cap offering minimal protection. The less said about the pointy bit on top, the better. It seems self-explanatory that the last thing you want, while walking around in a trench, is an arrow on your head pointing down at the same. That is not a smart survival strategy. Which is why they switched to the legendary Stahlhelm later on, as can be seen on the right. This was an all-steel helmet, offering excellent protection, especially in the neck area, which would become a trademark of the German soldier for decades to come. We have now made the transition to the pictures from the museum, by the way. This picture shows the former battlefield in 1929, and if you think the area looks pretty devastated, you are right. However, it's not only due to the war. There has also been a forest fire, which didn't help matters. As you can see, the crypt and the monument are still being worked at. The picture was taken from the west, looking east, which is the direction we will be taking walking up to the top. This next panel is dedicated to artillery. Artillery in mountain warfare, specifically. Let me just read the English text for you. Artillery in mountain warfare. Mountain warfare requires specific equipment that can be transported along narrow, steep roads. The French mountain artillery had existed since 1988. The German mountain artillery was put together in October 1914. Mountain guns can be fired upwards or downwards. They can be fired at targets located at different altitudes. They can be dismantled into several loads that can be transported by mules. Mortars were especially important. You can see some examples in the pictures to the left, up, and to the right. The example to the right being a German trench mortar of 24 cm caliber. The diagram towards the center, however, shows the position from which both parties shelled the mountain top. The French shooting from within the mountain range, the Germans from the plain aiming upwards. Here are some examples of the shells that were used, with a visitor for scale. Here's a map showing the differences in altitude between the different locations. Thann, which we recently visited, is all the way down at the foot of the mountains, while Hartmannswillerkopf is up there. The red line shows the French positions, the blue one the Germans. Turning around, looking at the map from a different angle, we can easily see why Hartmannswillerkopf was that important. As the highest peak of the outlying mountains, it offered an excellent view of the plain below. If the Germans had allowed the French to take that position, they would have had a commanding view of the entire Upper Rhine plain, and would have also been able to shell nearby railroad lines. Therefore, neither side was willing to give up on it. Unknown to most, transport animals were of great importance in both world wars, especially on the German side. Unfortunately, that also meant they suffered to a similar degree as the soldiers did, as can be seen here. This is one of the German 24 cm mortars, plus ammunition. And I can assure you, in reality, they're even more impressive. But now the time has come to leave the museum behind and get into the actual terrain. We'll start with the crypt, approaching it from the west, like I already said. According to French Wikipedia of early 2026, this crypt contains the remains of approximately 12,000 soldiers, which could no longer be identified. There are 3 chapels in there, dedicated to Catholicism, Protestantism, and Judaism. I will show you the pictures uncommented, and we'll see each other again on the other side. This is the monument. basically on top of the crypt. As you can see, people from all over France fought here. Directly ahead, the military cemetery, holding 1640 graves. Nobody knows for sure how many men died on this mountain, but the overall accepted number of French and German fallen combined seems to accumulate to about 30,000, and around 3 to 4 times dead and wounded. A staggering number, especially considering this was only a side scenario of World War I. Can you see the tiny white cross in the distance on top of the hill? This is roughly where the front line used to be. Of course the soldiers had their own names for this place. The French called it Ville Armand, Hartmann, HWK, or the Man-Eater. The Germans, on the other hand, HK, the Mountain of Death, or the Sacred Mountain. An unspecified number of the fallen of both nations still remaining in its soil. This is the trail we will be following, and since we will be approaching from the west, we will see the French positions first. I will show you the pictures uncommented and get back to you once we reach no man's land. This is no man's land in front of the French lines in December 1915. As you can see, everything has been destroyed by constant artillery bombardment. This is what large parts of the Western Front used to look like, and Hartmannswillerkopf was no exception. All plant and animal life had been devastated, except for insects, rats and maggots, who grew fat feasting on the flesh of the fallen. We are now very close to the giant cross we saw earlier. It was erected as a symbol of Franco-German reconciliation. Ironically, in 1936, a time when the National Socialists were already in power in Germany and in the process of preparing yet another war. It is 20 meters high and over 5 meters wide. Thus it can be seen from afar. As a matter of fact, we saw it from the crypt already. And just in case you don't remember, here's a picture and here's the cross we are looking at right now. But back to the battlefield. This little metal box is a French observation position. In one place the German lines are only 20 meters away. So we will cross over and take a look at those now, passing this monument on the way. It is dedicated to the 28th Mountain Infantry Battalion, who fought here in defense of a most advanced combat post, the last survivors of the station finally being captured after a month of fighting. And here we finally are. Here's another text from one of the info panels. Entering the German trench system, you will immediately notice the difference between French and German field organization at Hartmannswillerkopf. Here, almost the whole trench system is made with masonry. Its labyrinthine effect is both oppressive and disorienting, illustrating perfectly the difficult conditions and confinement in which German soldiers lived. Only slight, poor and rare glimpses of opposing soldiers could be caught in the trench. But not all the ruins up here are from the First World War. This house, for example, is from the Second. It belonged to a German general, who was the commander of a trench warfare school. He had his house connected to the World War I tunnel system and used it as a training ground for his soldiers, learning from history in his own way. But enough of that, and back to the ruins of World War I. While there's a great number of them in the vicinity, you are not allowed to enter most of them, which is not in order to protect the buildings, but the visitors instead, as many of those structures could collapse at any time. They are also home to many endangered species, like bats for example, which are not to be disturbed, especially during the hibernation cycle. We are now getting closer to the top of the mountain. Leaving most of the trees behind, the view is pretty amazing from up here, but we will have opportunity to enjoy it later on. There's also another large monument ahead. It's the most impressive one Hartmannswillerkopf has to offer, and we will take a look at it shortly, as you can barely see it from this angle. When it comes down to it, Hartmannswillerkopf is more like an anthill than a mountain. Wherever you go, you find tunnels, bunkers and artificial caves. German miners work day and night to turn this into a fortress. Here's a picture of some of them, and here's some of the equipment they left behind. Here's the monument, by the way. We're just a couple of steps away. So let's get up there and take a closer look. That's it in all its glory. However, this is not the original anymore, for this one was destroyed during the Second World War by German troops. What you're looking at here is a rebuild from after the Second World War, using as many of the parts of the original as possible. And just in case you're wondering, yes, this railing was made using original mortar shells from back then. This place offers a great view already, but we can still climb a couple of meters higher. So we will, going right through the rock. Coming out the other side, we can see yet another cross, this one being far smaller however. Just 6 meters high, it was erected in memory of those from Alsace who served in World War I. Most of them fighting for the French, but some also on the German side. We have reached the highest point now, and the view is really breathtaking. But don't take my word for it. Look for yourself. When facing south, we can even see the Swiss city of Basel faintly in the distance. You may remember the skyscraper from our visit to Augusta Raurica and the Isteiner Klotz. This time, however, we are much further away. Here's another clip for you, from a little bit further back, offering a better view towards the south. Being at the uttermost edge of the mountain range, overlooking the upper Rhine plain, we have reached the furthest point of our hike. So it is time for us to turn back. Here are some more pictures for you to enjoy from along the way. Almost back at the giant cross, we encounter Dora Fortress, one of the more important German defensive positions, which was of course also used as a staging point for attacks on the French line. One of the panels up here describing one such attack. And I quote, "Dora, the cavern of the beast of the apocalypse." At the start of October 1915, the Guards pioneers set up a heavy flamethrower in Dora, which was to be used while attacking the rock at the summit. At 6 AM on October the 15th, a huge flame came spurting out of the Dora trench. It spread like a heavy sheet of black smoke, and in the dawn light, a wild grey color, it sizzled as it climbed. "The Gross whistled and spat like a beast of the apocalypse for half an hour," said Captain Good. "It silenced the French machine guns and enabled the capture of the French front line and rock at the summit." But flamethrowers weren't everything. There's also evidence for the use of poison gas. Basically, every profanity that man could think of was thrown at the enemy. Towards the end of the war, American troops were involved in the fighting up here as well, which is an interesting detail to note. Almost back at the cemetery, our visit to Hartmannswillerkopf comes to an end. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider liking, subscribing and sharing. It would be most appreciated. Furthermore, I hope to see you again on the next episode, when we will be visiting not a battlefield, but a military installation nonetheless, which will be Belfort, the invincible citadel.